Here's what I can't get past about that Munich moment. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't walk into a friendly room and misplace a comma. She walked into the kind of room that lives on commas, where every adjective gets weighed like it's a treaty clause. And in this imagined telling, the stumble wasn't even on a classified briefing or a complicated alliance structure. It was on cowboys, the most American word in the global vocabulary, besides Hollywood. She tried to turn Marco Rubio's history into a punchline, and the punchline turned around and bit her. She set it up with the kind of confidence that plays like rocket fuel on domestic stages. You can almost see the internal math. A quick jab, a laugh, a moral contrast, then move on before anyone checks the footnotes. That formula works when the audience wants the vibe more than the citation. But Munich isn't a vibe room. Munich is where people who actually read the boring parts of history show up on purpose. When she smiled and tossed out that line, Spain, cowboys, and a wink toward who really gets to claim the myth, it wasn't malicious, it was performative. It sounded like the sort of thing that's meant to signal, I'm on the side of the overlooked. And plenty of audiences reward that signal instantly, no questions asked, because it feels like justice with a mic drop. But a mic drop is a risky move when the other person is standing there with a microphone and a stack of facts that don't need to be loud. Rubio, in this version, didn't get mad. He got clinical, which is always worse. The teaching opportunity line is the tell. That phrase isn't anger, it's hierarchy. It's the verbal equivalent of pulling a chair out from under someone and watching them sit anyway. He didn't argue her values, he corrected her premise. And then he explained why premise matters. He basically said, without saying it, if you can't get this right, why should anyone trust you on the hard stuff? And the hard truth is that the cowboy origin story really is tangled up with Spain, Mexico, indigenous practice, African labor, and every messy layer that makes Americans uncomfortable. So her instinct, this is complicated, this is multicultural, this isn't one clean lineage, wasn't crazy. What was crazy was assuming that complicated meant Rubio must be wrong. It's a very modern political reflex. If the person is on the other team, the fact must be counterfeit. That reflex plays well online. It plays like amateur hour in a room full of professionals. Rubio's response, as you wrote it, was devastating because it was calm and specific. He didn't call her stupid. He didn't sneer. He didn't need to. He just laid out the vocabulary, vaqueros, lazo, rodeo, rancho, and let the audience do the humiliating arithmetic in their own heads. That's the first lesson in the scene. On a world stage, confidence isn't charisma. It's liability if it's not paired with preparation. At home, politicians can survive by being emotionally right, even when they're technically sloppy. Abroad, technical sloppiness reads like disrespect, sometimes to the audience, sometimes to history, sometimes to the basic expectation that you did the reading. And when the room realizes you didn't, they don't boo. They go quiet, which is the kind of quiet that doesn't forgive. Then comes Taiwan, the question that separates people who are fluent in slogans from people who are fluent in consequences. AOC, in your scenario, tries to answer the way a domestic politician answers. Broaden, soften, make it about hopes and values, and avoiding conflict. That's not immoral. It's just not enough for that room. Because for the people sitting there, defense ministers, intelligence chiefs, diplomats, we hope it never happens, is what you say before you explain what you do if it happens anyway. Rubio's reply lands because it's short and shaped like policy. He doesn't overpromise, he doesn't over-explain, He doesn't hand adversaries a soundbite to weaponize. He gives the room what it wants. The sense that the United States understands the stakes and speaks carefully on purpose. And next to that, a meandering answer doesn't just look weak. It looks unserious. That's not a partisan verdict. It's the performance standard of that environment. Here's the part that would sting if you're Ocasio-Cortez. It's not that she's incapable of learning this material. It's that the moment implies she didn't think she needed to. And why would she, if she's been rewarded for years for moral clarity and rhetorical force? In American politics, we hand out trophies for passion all day long. In foreign policy circles, passion is table stakes. Competence is the entry ticket. The geography slip, Venezuela and the equator, isn't important on its own. Nobody's hiring a president to be a human atlas. But in political storytelling, it becomes symbolic. A small mistake that functions like a crack in a windshield. Suddenly, everyone sees it everywhere. Once the audience suspects you're improvising, every pause starts sounding like uncertainty. Every broad phrase starts sounding like evasion. And your opponent doesn't even have to attack you. They can just keep being precise until the contrast becomes the story. Then the Middle East segment, in your telling, is where the air changes. That's because charged words don't behave the same way in every country, and they definitely don't behave the same way in Munich. Americans throw language like a spear, sharp, moral, immediate, because our distance from old European trauma lets us. Europeans, especially Germans, often handle the same words like explosives. Carefully, slow hands, no sudden movements. So when AOC drops the kind of moral indictment that electrifies certain domestic audiences, it doesn't just land as a position, it lands as a collision with memory. Rubio's response works in your narrative because he doesn't argue politics first. He argues place. He basically says, in this city, words come with receipts written in blood and ash, so choose them carefully. It's not a gotcha, it's a reframing that makes everyone in the room sit up straighter. And it forces AOC into the worst corner for a politician. The corner where any further escalation looks reckless, but retreat looks like weakness. This is where a lot of American commentators miss the dynamic. They want to score the exchange as if it's cable news. Who landed a hit? Who looked flustered? Who won? But for that audience, the win is reassurance. The whole point of a U.S. presence in a place like Munich is to make allies feel steadier and adversaries feel less tempted. Rubio is playing that game. AOC, in your version, keeps playing the domestic game, where the audience is a camera and the prize is resonance. And the Estonia intervention, whether literal or dramatized, does something that no American opponent can do. It yanks the conversation out of U.S. partisan categories and into lived European memory. When someone from the Baltics talks about ideology, it's not theoretical, it's generational. That doesn't automatically make them right about everything, but it changes the emotional physics of the room. Suddenly, AOC isn't debating Rubio. She's debating a continent's scar tissue. If you want a single image that captures the problem, it's the pivot to the camera. I'm not saying that's immoral. Every modern politician knows the real audience is often the one watching later. But in a room full of people who make decisions in private, turning away from them to address the lenses reads like a confession. I'm not actually here to persuade you. And if they conclude you're auditioning instead of governing, you don't get heckled. You get downgraded, quietly, permanently. That quiet downgrade is the part that would terrify any serious candidate. Because voters can be won back with time and messaging and a better clip next week. Diplomatic confidence is harder. It's built slowly, and it evaporates fast. The worst outcome isn't a hostile headline. It's the subtle shift where allies start treating you as a domestic celebrity rather than a potential commander-in-chief. Now, to be fair, because fairness is the one luxury political fandom rarely allows, Ocasio-Cortez has strengths Rubio doesn't. She can translate moral urgency into mass attention, and that's not nothing. A politician who can't move people emotionally is limited, but the Munich premise exposes the trap. Emotion without command of specifics is great for a movement and risky for a state. And the question hanging over the whole scene becomes unavoidable. Can she build the second skill set without losing the first? The internet, of course, would feast. It always does, because the internet loves a person falling off a high wire, even when it pretends it hates the circus. The cowboy clip becomes a looping humiliation machine because it's easy to understand in 10 seconds. The Taiwan clip becomes a side-by-side comparison because is a universal language. The geography correction becomes a meme because it reduces a complicated person into a simple laugh line. And none of that proves she's unfit for office. It proves that modern politics is merciless to anyone who walks into the wrong room with the wrong toolkit. Here's the more interesting question, the one that keeps the story from being just a dunk fest. What exactly is Rubio doing here? Is he defending the country or defending his turf? Is he educating or is he staging a contrast for future domestic consumption? People in power don't do anything on a stage like that by accident. And if AOC is there auditioning, Rubio might be auditioning too, just in the opposite direction, as the grown-up in the room, the reassuring voice, the guy who can answer the questions without tripping over them. That's what makes the scene feel consequential, even if we treat it as political fiction. It isn't just AOC embarrassed, it's two different models of leadership collided in a venue that rewards one and punishes the other. The populist influencer politician meets the institutional operator with international muscle memory, and the room picks a favorite, not based on ideology, but based on which one makes the room feel safer. The aftermath you describe, donors hedging, allies going quiet, think tanks postponing, doesn't need to be dramatized as a conspiracy. It's just how risk works. Money hates uncertainty. Gatekeepers hate unpredictability. And one shaky foreign policy performance can reframe someone from potential president to compelling messenger, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it's a demotion. And Rubio's final move, declining to keep talking about her, redirecting to NATO, is the coldest kind of dismissal. Not because it's rude, because it implies she's not the story. For someone whose power is built on being the story, that's existential. The most painful enemy isn't the one who attacks you. It's the one who moves on like you were never the main character. So the question your ending lands on is the only one that matters in this genre of politics. What does the world grade, and what does America reward? America often rewards performance, moral certainty, and the ability to dominate a clip. The world rewards clarity, restraint, and the ability to answer the exact question that was asked. AOC, in this telling, brought the first set of skills into a room demanding the second. And the room didn't punish her with outrage. It punished her with quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't trend but decides things anyway. By the time Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez landed back in New York in this story, the problem wasn't that people were mad at her. Anger is manageable, because anger still means you're the center of the frame. The problem was something colder, something that shows up in politics the way frost shows up on a windshield overnight. The calls that normally came fast, friendly texts from allied lawmakers, invitations from serious foreign policy shops, The "we should grab coffee" notes from donors who want to be seen wanting you didn't stop entirely. They slowed, and the slowing was the message. Her team did what every modern team does when the clip is bad and the clock is ticking. They tried to reframe the event as proof of her authenticity, proof that she challenged power and refused to be intimidated by a polished establishment figure. They pushed the line that the room was biased, the format was stacked, the moderator was cold. The entire thing was designed to embarrass a progressive woman in front of European elites. And to be honest, if you've spent enough time around political rooms, you know there's always some truth in that kind of claim. But some truth is not the same thing as a winning argument, and Europe does not hand out participation trophies for intent. The first sign of real trouble wasn't a headline. It was a calendar cancellation that arrived without drama, dressed up as logistics. A Washington think tank that had teased a major address quietly postponed due to scheduling conflicts, which is the kind of phrase that means nobody wanted their name on the flyer. A European foundation that had requested a private breakfast suddenly wanted to circle back after the spring convening, which is just polite English for, "We're going to see what the next few weeks do to your reputation." In politics, the sharpest knives are often wrapped in linen napkins. Meanwhile, Rubio's people didn't gloat, at least not publicly. They didn't need to, because the atmosphere did it for them. When a moment like that lands, the opponent doesn't have to keep punching. Gravity does the rest. Rubio didn't tour the studios yelling, "Gotcha!" because yelling would have lowered him into the same ecosystem where she already thrives. He just kept acting like the Secretary of State, and the contrast stayed alive without effort. In this imagined aftermath, the Munich crowd broke into two audiences the way audiences always do now. There was the online audience, which is loud and fast, and rewards whichever clip makes them feel righteous. Then there was the institutional audience, which is quieter and slower, and rewards whoever makes them feel safe. AOC still owned the first audience because she knows how to speak its language fluently. But Munich was a stress test for the second audience, and stress tests don't care about vibes. That's the part that would keep a strategist up at night. Not because a single event defines a politician, but because a single event can define how a certain class of people talks about you in private. Public narratives are negotiable. Private labels are sticky. Once a room starts calling you a communicator instead of a decision-maker, you can feel the floor drop a little under your feet. You can still be famous, still be beloved, still raise money, and still find doors closing quietly anyway. AOC's defenders, in this story, tried to shift the conversation back to what she does best. They pointed out that Rubio can speak in crisp sentences, sure, but crisp sentences didn't build his career. Coalition building did. They reminded everyone that foreign policy isn't a trivia contest, and a stray geography slip doesn't erase the moral urgency of climate, labor, or inequality. They argued that Rubio's performance felt like a professor grading a student in public, which reads as smug to a lot of Americans. And again, there's truth there, because smugness has ended plenty of careers. But here's the catch. Smugness only kills you if the other person is also wrong. When the other person is smug and right, the smugness becomes part of the brand. People tolerate arrogance when it comes attached to competence, the same way they tolerate turbulence when they trust the pilot. Munich, in this telling, made Rubio look like a pilot, and AOC look like someone live-streaming from the cabin. That's not fair, maybe, but politics has never been fair. It's just been real. Inside the democratic ecosystem, the reaction wasn't a public rebuke. No one wants to be the person who kneecaps a star and then gets blamed when the base gets angry. So the reaction came as a series of subtle edits, the kind of changes you only notice if you've been watching the script for years. A fundraiser who used to say, "She's the future," started saying, "She's a powerful voice." A consultant who used to say, "She can win a general," started saying, "She can drive turnout," which sounds similar until you realize it's not. There's a reason political professionals love synonyms. Synonyms let you downgrade someone without saying you're downgrading them. They let you change the temperature of a room without turning on a visible fan. And Munich, in this storyline, wasn't a scandal where people needed to condemn her. It was worse than a scandal, because it was a competence question. And competence questions don't go away with apologies. She tried to muscle through with sheer momentum. She scheduled a run of appearances that looked, on paper, like strength. Interviews, campus speeches, labor events, climate roundtables, quick hits with friendly hosts. She emphasized the idea that foreign policy is not just generals and treaties, it's supply chains and wages and corporate power, which is actually a smart reframing. She argued that security includes housing, health, and dignity, which is true in a way that a lot of traditionalists refuse to admit. But the shadow of Munich followed her because the shadow wasn't ideological. It was optical. Optics are brutal because they are not arguments. They are impressions. An impression doesn't care how many footnotes you add after the fact. An impression is what people saw, what they felt, what they tell their friend in one sentence. And if the one sentence becomes, "She froze when asked about Taiwan," that sentence sticks to everything else you say for a while. You can give 10 strong answers later and still spend months paying off one weak clip. In the background, Republicans did what Republicans always do when a Democrat gifts them a moment. They tried to turn it into a character summary. Not, "She had a rough night," but "She's unfit," which is the kind of leap politics makes constantly and shamelessly. Democrats, on the other hand, did what Democrats always do when a Republican is feasting. They argued among themselves about whether to ignore it or fight it. And the fight or ignore debate is how you can tell an issue is real, because nobody wastes energy on a thing that isn't landing. Rubio's allies started circulating a phrase that sounded diplomatic and deadly. They called him reassuring, which is the most valuable adjective in foreign policy and the most boring adjective in domestic politics. They pointed out that he didn't take the bait. He didn't posture. He didn't posture even when he could have. They framed the exchange as Rubio protecting American credibility, not Rubio scoring a point. And credibility, once you put that word on the table, becomes a weapon because nobody wants to be the person accused of spending it recklessly. AOC's allies countered with their own framing. They said the credibility talk is often a mask for the same old priorities: militarism, extraction, and an elite consensus that never asked ordinary people what they wanted. They reminded everyone that Rubio's worldview is deeply tied to old Cold War instincts, and that instincts can be wrong even when they're confident. They argued that courage looks like challenging the room, not pleasing it, and that AOC challenged it by refusing to speak in clichés. But the room, in this telling, didn't hear challenging. It heard unprepared, and those are not the same word in any language. The most telling moments were the ones nobody clipped. AOC reportedly stayed late, off camera, speaking with a couple of Eastern European diplomats in a small side room. She asked questions, more questions than she usually asks in public, and she listened longer than she usually listens when the camera isn't begging her to perform. That part never went viral, because growth never goes viral. Humiliation goes viral, correction goes viral, and the quiet work of actually learning just looks like a person sitting in a chair. If you want to know whether a politician is adapting, you don't watch their best speech. You watch how they talk when the applause isn't guaranteed. You watch whether they can say, "I didn't know that," without treating it like death. In this version of events, AOC struggled with that because her brand has always been built on certainty. And certainty is a drug. It feels powerful until you realize you can't function without it. Her team began building a kind of foreign policy crash program around her. Not the public kind where you announce, "I'm studying," because announcing you're studying is admitting you weren't ready. The private kind. Briefings with retired diplomats, sessions with trade experts, careful tutoring on alliance structures, a lot of "here's how this actually works" conversations. The people brought in were serious, which mattered because serious people don't volunteer their reputations to help someone they think is a lost cause. Still, seriousness doesn't guarantee transformation. It just makes transformation possible. And here's where the story gets more interesting than a simple takedown. Because the more AOC tried to learn the language of foreign policy, the more she faced a question that every populist figure faces eventually. How do you become fluent without becoming domesticated? How do you gain precision without losing the fire that made people follow you in the first place? The thing about institutions is that they don't just teach you, they shape you. Rubio, for his part, had his own risk. If he looked too pleased with himself, he would feed the impression that he cared more about humiliating a domestic rival than about coalition building abroad. And foreign policy professionals, for all their stiffness, can smell vanity from a mile away. So he kept his tone mild, his schedule full, his press lines short. He kept talking about NATO, not AOC, because the surest way to keep the victory is to pretend it wasn't one. That doesn't mean his team didn't understand what they had. They understood the difference between an argument and a symbol. Munich, in this telling, became a symbol of two possible futures: the influencer-politician future and the institutional operator future. Symbols are more valuable than facts, because facts can be debated and symbols just sit there. And Rubio now had a symbol that made him look like the adult who can handle the room. AOC's people tried to create a counter-symbol. They framed Rubio as the avatar of an old bipartisan consensus that treats ordinary people like props and war like background noise. They emphasized that he knows the names of treaties, but not the price of groceries, which is the kind of line that works in Queens and doesn't matter in Brussels. They pushed the idea that the Munich audience is exactly the kind of elite audience Democrats shouldn't be trying to impress anyway. But the problem wasn't impressing Munich. It was proving she could handle it. There's a difference between saying, "I don't care what the elites think," and demonstrating you can outthink them and still choose not to. The first sounds defensive. The second sounds powerful. In this storyline, Munich made her look defensive for the first time in a long time. And that's a vulnerable look for someone built like a brand. Because brands can survive hate, but they struggle with doubt. The next big test came not in Europe, but at home, in a setting designed to look like seriousness. A closed-door roundtable in Washington with former ambassadors and a few hawkish Democrats who were curious, skeptical, and not impressed by social media follower counts. AOC walked in with a binder, because politics is a theater of props and everyone knows it, and because she understands visuals as well as any politician alive. The binder wasn't a gimmick. It was an attempt to signal, "I heard the criticism." And the funny thing about signals is that they work only when the room believes the substance is behind them. In this version, she performed better than expected. She spoke less and asked more, which is a rare skill among people whose job is talking. She didn't try to win every exchange, which is another rare skill among modern stars. She admitted she hadn't spent enough time on certain questions, and she said it without turning it into a victim narrative. That bought her a little credibility, the first deposit after a very public withdrawal. But credibility is slow to rebuild, especially when your public identity is built on being instantly right. The press, hungry for a sequel, started asking every foreign policy question like it was a trap. If she answered quickly, they wrote, "She's overcorrecting." If she answered carefully, they wrote, "She hesitates again." If she refused to play, they wrote, "She dodges," because the media is never more creative than when it's labeling someone else's caution as weakness. And in the background, the 2028 conversation started to solidify around a familiar dynamic. Not who inspires, because inspiration is everywhere now, cheap and abundant, but who reassures, because reassurance feels scarce in a country that's exhausted. Rubio fit reassurance abroad. AOC fit inspiration at home. The question was whether either could expand into the other's lane without losing their base. Here's the part that would keep the tension alive. AOC is not stupid. Whatever you think of her politics, she is a talented communicator with real instincts. People like that don't just collapse because one night went badly. They adapt, or they harden, and either path is consequential. And Munich, in this telling, forces her to choose between being a movement's voice and being a state's steward. She could double down on the idea that foreign policy is mostly a scam run by elites, and that the only honest thing is to reject the whole language. That path would keep her beloved by the people who already love her. Or she could accept that the world is complicated in ways that don't bend to domestic narratives, and that a potential president has to speak in commitments, not just critiques. That path would earn her respect in rooms that currently doubt her, but it would also anger some of her own fans, because fans hate evolution. Fans want the album to sound like the first album forever. In this continuation, she chose the harder route, at least partially. She started giving speeches that included actual numbers and actual names of agreements, not just moral framing. She stopped treating diplomacy like an afterthought and started treating it like a discipline, which it is. She didn't turn into Rubio, because nobody turns into Rubio unless they're Rubio. But she began showing flashes of a different kind of seriousness. And that terrified her opponents more than the Munich clips ever did, because mockery is easy to beat if you can grow. Rubio noticed, because politicians always notice when the target starts moving. He began referencing her less, not more, which is what you do when the other person might become interesting. He kept his attacks focused on ideology rather than competence, because ideology fights are evergreen, and competence fights can flip if the person improves. He leaned harder into the theme that the world is dangerous, and the United States needs steadiness. And steadiness, in a nervous electorate, is a selling point that doesn't require you to be loved. The next time they shared a stage, the vibe was different. AOC didn't try to land a joke about cowboys. Rubio didn't offer to teach. They both understood the stakes were bigger now, because the first encounter created a storyline that demanded a second act. And second acts are where reputations get repaired or sealed. In this imagined second act, AOC still isn't the kind of foreign policy speaker who makes a room full of defense ministers relax. That's not her nature, and pretending it is would look fake. But she's sharper, more disciplined, more willing to answer the question that was asked instead of the question she wishes had been asked. She makes fewer errors that can be turned into symbols, and that alone changes the dynamic, because it takes away the cheap laughs and forces Rubio into actual disagreement instead of corrective performance. And that's the twist. The easiest opponent to beat is the one who hands you their mistakes. The harder opponent is the one who learns. If AOC learns, the fight stops being, "Is she ready?" and becomes, "Do you agree with her?" which is a much riskier fight for Rubio, because agreement is a moving target. Competence can be demonstrated. Agreement has to be won, and winning it is harder than mocking it. So the story doesn't end with Munich as a tombstone. It ends with Munich as a scar, And scars don't always weaken you. Sometimes they just remind you where not to step again. The world doesn't grade on a curve, that's true, but it also doesn't freeze your grade forever if you retake the test. The only question that matters after a public failing isn't whether you fell, it's whether you learned how to land. And landing, for a politician whose entire rise was built on speed, might be the hardest skill of all. Because speed is intoxicating when it works. It lets you outrun nuance, outrun fact checks, outrun the slow machinery of institutional doubt. But once you've been forced to slow down in public, once the room has seen you hesitate, you don't get to pretend gravity isn't real anymore. You either learn to walk differently, or you keep tripping over the same step. In the months that followed in this imagined arc, the questions never fully stopped. Every foreign policy panel she joined carried an invisible subtitle. Is she ready now? Every time she spoke about China, about NATO, about the Middle East, the audience leaned forward not just to hear her position, but to test her precision. That kind of scrutiny can crush a politician, or it can refine one. Refinement is quieter than collapse, but it's far more dangerous to opponents. Rubio, for his part, couldn't afford to treat Munich as the final word. Victory laps in politics have a short shelf life, especially when the other person is young and ambitious. If he leaned too heavily on the "I corrected her" narrative, he risked looking petty, like a man reliving his best punchline from last season. So he did what seasoned operators do. He shifted the battlefield back to policy. He talked about alliances, deterrence, supply chains, energy corridors, the dull but essential architecture of global order. And here's where the tension tightens instead of fading. Because once AOC started answering with more detail, the debate stopped being about trivia and started being about worldview. Is the world best navigated through incremental alliances and cautious commitments, or through moral reorientation and structural overhaul? Is reassurance the highest virtue in unstable times, or is disruption sometimes necessary to prevent deeper instability later? Those are not questions that can be laughed off with a geography correction. The electorate, meanwhile, is never just one thing. There are voters who crave steadiness, who want a leader who sounds like they've read every memo. There are others who crave conviction, who want a leader who sounds like they're willing to tear up the memo if it's wrong. Munich framed Rubio as the memo reader and AOC as the memo challenger. But politics rarely lets you stay in a single frame forever. If she manages to blend conviction with command of detail, she becomes something harder to dismiss. If he manages to blend command of detail with a broader emotional appeal, he becomes harder to caricature. And that is where the real contest lives, not in a single viral exchange, not in a single embarrassed pause, but in the long stretch afterward where perception calcifies or evolves. The world may not grade on a curve, but it does watch who comes back to the exam room better prepared.